Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, introductory course titled Essential Fish Habitat, provided by the Florida Department of Transportation, or FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM. This training is part of a series of introductory courses that provide guidance on FDOT's process for complying with NEPA, called Project Development and Environment, or PD&E. Please see the Environmental Management Academy course catalog in the FDOT Learning Curve or the OEM website PD&E training track for other computer-based trainings in this series. Several of these trainings are referenced throughout the CBT. A link to these sites can be found on the resources page of the CBT. The purpose of this training is to introduce essential fish habitat and discuss the analysis, coordination, and documentation required during project development. Please note that you may pause this training at any time. This course is comprised of 5 lessons. Lesson 1 will define the basics of essential fish habitat, or EFH. Lesson 2 will discuss how to determine the level of assessment required for EFH. Lesson 3 will provide guidance on actions needed if there is no EFH assessment required. Lesson 4 will provide guidance on preparing an EFH assessment. We'll discuss National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, consultation as well as emergency consultation, and we'll also cover EFH conservation recommendations. Lesson 5 will detail documentation and commitments required for EFH, and we'll discuss the potential impact of EFH on design and permitting, and we'll also cover reevaluations. Information on essential fish habitat can be found in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E Manual. The chapter, titled Essential Fish Habitat, outlines procedures for determining the effects of transportation projects on essential fish habitat. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on FDOT's Office of Environmental Management website using the link provided. This link can also connect you to other chapters of the PD&E manual that are referenced throughout this training. Let's begin with Lesson 1. What is essential fish habitat, or EFH? Title 16, Section 1802 of the United States Code, or USC, designates essential fish habitat as those waters and substrate necessary to fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. As indicated in this definition, EFH includes a wide range of aquatic habitats that are known to support fish at various stages of their life cycles. Examples of these types of habitats include wetlands, coral reefs, seagrasses, and rivers. High priorities for EFH conservation are called Habitat Areas of Particular Concern, or HAPCs. HAPCs. These areas are defined as habitats or habitat associations that are rare, particularly susceptible to human-induced degradation, especially ecologically important, or located in an environmentally stressed area. Examples of HAPCs include coastal estuaries, canopy kelp, shallow corals, seagrass, and rocky reefs. In 1976, the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, or Magnuson-Stevens Act, was passed to ensure long-term biological and economic sustainability of the nation's marine fisheries. The main objectives of the Act include prevention of overfishing, rebuilding of overfished stocks, increased long-term economic and social benefits, conservation of essential fish habitat, and assurance of a safe and sustainable seafood supply. The National Marine Fisheries Service serves as the regulatory agency responsible for enforcing the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Title 16, Section 1801 of the USC created regional fishery management councils, responsible for the fisheries that require conservation and management in their region. These councils are also required to develop and amend fishery management plans, specific to each fishery management council's regions, fisheries, and fish stocks. Fishery management plans also provide information on HAPCs located within EFH areas. In 1996, the Magnuson-Stevens Act was amended. This amendment set forth a mandate for the National Marine Fisheries Service and regional fishery management councils to identify and protect important marine and anadromous fish habitat and to establish means for designating EFH. Please note that anadromous fish species are born in fresh water and migrate to ocean to mature and then return to freshwater to spawn. Chapter 50 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, sections 600.805 through 600.930 outline rules to implement the EFH provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. This chapter specifies that fishery management plan amendments be prepared to describe and identify essential fish habitat. As per 50 section CFR 600.815, fishery management plans must describe and identify essential fish habitat in text that clearly states the habitat or habitat types determined to be EFH for each life cycle of the managed species. They should explain the physical, biological, and chemical characteristics of the EFH, and if known, how these characteristics influence the use of EFH by species and life stage. They must also identify the specific geographic location or extent of habitats described as EFH and must include maps of the geographic locations of EFH or the geographic boundaries within which EFH for each species and life stage is found. Chapter 50 also establishes procedures to promote the protection of EFH through interagency coordination. As mentioned, the Fishery Management Plans, or FMPs, provide information on HAPSES within essential fish habitat areas. There are 2 fishery management councils in Florida that regulate FMPs for 200 nautical miles past state waters. The Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council implements fishery management plans for EFH, as well as aquaculture, coastal migratory pelagics, coral, red drum, reef fish, shrimp, spiny lobster, and stone crab. The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council also implements fishery management plans for EFH, coastal migratory pelagics, coral, shrimp, and spiny lobster. Additional fishery management plans include dolphin, wahoo, golden crab, sargassum, and snapper and grouper. When projects have potential impacts to the fishery management plan for a given EFH area, coordination with these councils is required. Interagency coordination is outlined in Section 305(b)(2) of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. As per the Act, federal agencies are required to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service regarding projects that fund, permit, or carry out activities that may adversely affect EFH. An adverse effect means any impact that reduces quality and/or quantity of EFH. Please refer to the 2004 guidance, Preparing Essential Fish Habitat Assessments, a guide for federal action agencies, for more information. A link to this document can be found on the resources page of the CBT. Further detail regarding EFH assessments will also be covered in future lessons. Essential fish habitat consultations are required for federal projects as well as projects requiring a federal action, such as a federal permit. EFH consultation requirements are subject to a NMFS finding pursuant to 50 CFR section 600.920E. EFH consultation requirements can be incorporated into the existing NEPA document, in this case through the Project Development and Environment, or PD&E process. On July 19, 2000, NMFS sent a letter to Federal Highway Administration and FDOT regarding how to conduct EFH consultations in the state of Florida. The procedure documented in this letter was developed pursuant to 50 CFR, section 600.920C. According to this letter, FDOT is responsible for determining potential involvement with designated EFH and HAPSES for a project.
We will now move to Lesson 2, in which we'll discuss determining the level of assessment required for a project. During the planning phase, some FDOT projects may qualify for the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM process. Refer to Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E Manual for more information regarding which projects qualify for ETDM screening. Regardless of whether a project qualifies for ETDM screening, coordination with NMFS is required for federal projects with potential essential fish habitat involvement or in instances that require a federal action, such as a federal permit. To determine the level of evaluation for projects that do not qualify for ETDM screening, perform a review of fishery management plans, fishery management councils, and literature to develop an abbreviated managed species list and coordinate with NMFS. If NIMS indicates that an EFH assessment is not required, follow the procedure outlined in Lesson 3. If NIMS indicates that an EFH assessment is required, follow the procedure outlined in Lesson 4. For projects that do not qualify for ETDM screening, the same process is used during ETDM screening to facilitate the NIMS coordination that ultimately determines if an EFH assessment is required. Preliminary information on EFH within the project area can be gathered from regional fishery management councils, also known as FMCs, and NIMS. The contact information for the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic councils is shown here and provided as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. Each council has lists of managed species and EFH identified within their jurisdictional area and specific fishery management plans for the species they manage. NIMS Southeast Regional Office also has fishery management plans and managed species list for the highly migratory species under their jurisdiction. This office can be contacted for more site-specific information. Additionally, EFH information from both NIMS and the regional fishery management councils is also available online. The fishery management plans developed by the regional fishery management councils and NIMS explain the physical, biological, and chemical characteristics of EFH. They also include information on species life history stages, species range maps, potential threats, and recommended conservation and enhancement measures. The amount of information available for EFH determinations will vary depending on which species may be affected. Fishery management plans also provide information on HAPSEs, which were defined earlier as habitats or habitat associations that are rare, particularly susceptible to human-induced degradation, especially ecologically important, or located in an environmentally stressed area. The fishery management councils identify each HAPSEs under their purview in their respective fishery management plans. HAPSEs should be specifically discussed and addressed as applicable during the EFH consultation process. More detail regarding EFH consultation will be provided in Lesson 4. One resource that can be used to gather preliminary EFH information is the NIMS Interactive EFH Mapper, pictured here. This mapper can be used to identify EFH species when projects have not been screened or if NIMS has not provided this information. It may also be helpful to use the NIMS Interactive EFH Mapper when developing a project's preliminary environmental discussion as part of the ETDM screening. However, this type of use is optional. More EFH information sources and websites can be found in figures from Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. The district may need to submit a request to NIMS for a list of managed species that may be affected by the project. This is called an abbreviated managed species list. For projects that qualify for ETDM process, NIMS generally responds during the ETDM screening with adequate information such that an essential fish habitat assessment can begin. This information can be found in the Programming Screen Summary Report developed during ETDM. NIMS comments during the screening may also include an abbreviated managed species list. When a project has not been screened, if there is not enough information after a project's ETDM screening, or if NIMS has not provided an abbreviated managed species list, the district should create their own list using the managed species list available from the Regional Fishery Management Council and NIMS. Once the list has been developed, the district should send a request to NIMS to confirm project-specific identification of EFH. It is recommended that each district send this request to the appropriate Habitat Conservation Division Florida office. A sample letter request is provided as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. Confirmation of the district's project-specific species list will ultimately help to begin and expedite the EFH assessment process if obtained prior to or at the beginning of the PD&E phase. Please note that the request of an abbreviated list is not an official procedure for EFH consultation, and NIMS is not required to respond. If NIMS does not respond to the request within 10 days, it is recommended for the district to begin the EFH assessment using its own compiled abbreviated list. Please note that the EFH should be identified for species on the abbreviated managed species list as part of the PD&E process. For projects that qualify for ETDM, the Programming Screen Summary Report and information from fishery management plans, fishery management councils, contacts, and from the literature review are reviewed during PD&E. This information from the ETDM screening should be used to inform and guide the EFH assessment as the PD&E study progresses. Initial information for the EFH assessment can be found in the Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAT, comments for the coastal and marine and wetlands and surface water issues. It may also be helpful to review ETAT comments on wildlife and habitat and water quality and quantity, as well as general project recommendations and anticipated permits. Any comments from NMFS are especially important. The Technical Studies Anticipated section of the Programming Screen Summary Report should state specifically when an EFH assessment is needed. During the ETDM screening, NMFS ETAT should have provided a list of federally managed species that the EFH assessment should address. As illustrated in this example, NMFS reviewed the early project information provided by FDOT on the ETDM website and documented that the sample project area provides habitat for several federally managed species, including sea turtles, multiple coral species, and the small-toothed sawfish. All of these species and their habitats should then be addressed by FDOT in the subsequent EFH assessment. The comments provided by NMFS as part of the ETDM process are a valuable resource of preliminary agency feedback that can be referred to as FDOT develops the EFH assessment during the PD&E phase. Generally, no EFH assessment is required for projects that have been assigned a no involvement degree of effect by NMFS. These projects do not have a direct or indirect effect. Projects that only have indirect effect typically be assigned a minimal degree of effect. An EFH assessment is not normally required for these types of projects either. As illustrated in the example, after documenting that there will be no EFH involvement for the sample project, NMFS stated that further consultation on this matter is not necessary unless future modifications are proposed and the proposed action may result in adverse impacts to EFH. Barring any major project changes, FDOT's coordination with NMFS is complete for the proposed project. If a project may adversely affect EFH, the NMFS will request that an EFH assessment be prepared as seen in this example. In this case, the request for an EFH assessment was made because the Howard Franklin Bridge Replacement PD&E project had the potential to impact submerged aquatic vegetation in Old Tampa Bay, including seagrass and shoreline mangroves. NMFS conducted a site inspection to confirm the existence of these resources prior to providing feedback on the project, and also requested that FDOT conduct a benthic resource survey to determine the presence, absence, and distribution of seagrasses and other benthic resources in the project area. The EFH assessment should be included as a section of the Natural Resources Evaluation, or NRE, and summarized in the environmental document for projects that may have direct effects on EFH. See OEM's NRE outline and guidance document for additional guidance on preparing the NRE. A link to this guidance document has been included in the resources page of this CBT. For projects that required EFH assessment but will not have a natural resources evaluation, the district will prepare an EFH assessment as a tech memo and include it in the project file. It is helpful to remember that information from fishery management plans, fishery management councils, and from literature review and contacts also serves as a reference material for the involvement determinations that will be made in the EFH assessment or tech memo. As a project advances into PD&E, it is important to address ETAT comments received during the EST screening event. FDOT may contact NMFS to discuss ETAT comments and the FDOT course of action to address their comments. For more information regarding this comment resolution, please refer to FDOT's ETDM manual. A link to this manual is found on the resources page of the CBT.
Lesson 3 will cover actions to take if no EFH assessment is needed for a project. If the project is located outside of areas where the Magnuson-Stevens Act applies, an EFH assessment is not required and consultation with NIMS is not required. For projects located in areas where the Magnuson-Stevens Act could apply, but the project will have no involvement with EFH or no adverse effect on EFH, no NIMS consultation is needed, but this should still be addressed in the environmental document. For Type 1 categorical exclusions, called CEs, or non-major state actions, also known as NMSAs, include supporting information in the Statewide Environmental Project Tracker or SWEPT project file. This includes information such as GIS data analysis, technical memos, site visits, and knowledge of the area. Inclusion of this documentation will support the determination that no EFH assessment is needed. For Type 2 CEs with no EFH involvement, mark the appropriate box on the Type 2 CE determination form in SWEPT. Include supporting information in the SWEPT project file. For environmental assessments known as EAs, environmental impact statements known as EISs, or State Environmental Impact Reports known as SEERs, add the statement to the environmental analysis section as appropriate. This project has been coordinated with NIMS and there is no involvement with or adverse effect on essential fish habitat. Therefore, essential fish habitat consultation is not required. Now let's begin Lesson 4, where we will discuss the EFH assessment and EFH consultation process. NIMS will provide comments during the ETDM process for projects with potential direct effects on EFH and may comment regarding indirect effects, such as stormwater from a bridge over a river that could flow within a nearby estuary. An assessment is required when specifically requested by NIMS or when FDOT determines that a project may adversely affect EFH. If an EFH assessment is required, then the following steps should be accomplished during the PD&E phase. 1. Address NIMS comments through the PD&E process. 2. Prepare an EFH assessment if requested by NIMS or if a potential adverse effect on EFH is anticipated. And 3. Request consultation with NIMS and provide the EFH assessment. Once consultation with NIMS has been initiated, the following steps should continue to occur during PD&E. NIMS will provide FDOT with a written project evaluation. This evaluation may include EFH conservation recommendations. FDOT will then respond to any NIMS conservation recommendations provided within the required timeline. FDOT then documents the results of consultation in the final environmental document. If NIMS receives information regarding an FDOT project that may adversely affect EFH and FDOT has not initiated EFH consultation, then NIMS may inform FDOT of the Magnuson-Stevens Act requirement to consult and ask FDOT to initiate EFH consultation. FDOT is not required to agree with NIMS's request. However, NIMS is required by the Magnuson-Stevens Act to provide EFH conservation recommendations, and FDOT is required to respond to these recommendations in writing, regardless of whether FDOT initiated consultation. An EFH assessment is an analysis of the project's potential adverse effects on EFH. If necessary, it will include measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those potential effects. An EFH assessment is required if there are potential adverse effects to EFH for the following types of projects: federal projects and projects that require a federal action, for example, a federal permit, regardless of cost of action or funding source. As the agency with jurisdiction over EFH, coordination with NIMS may be required during the EFH assessment. Documentation of the EFH assessment is typically included as the last section of the Natural Resources Evaluation, or NRE. The NRE documents protected species and habitat, wetlands, and essential fish habitat issues and can be provided to NIMS as an EFH assessment. For more information on when and how to prepare an NRE, please refer to OEM's NRE outline and guidance document. A link to this document can be found on the resources page. The EFH assessment section of the Natural Resources Evaluation must contain identification of EFH, HAPSES, and manage species that may be affected, an analysis of the effects, including indirect and cumulative effects of the project on EFH, HAPSES, managed species, and associated species by life history stage, proposed measures to avoid, minimize, mitigate, or otherwise offset adverse effects on EFH, and FDOT's determination regarding the effects of the project on EFH. For projects that do not require an NRE, the district will prepare the EFH assessment as a technical memo, depending on the degree to which the project may adversely impact EFH. Technical memos should use the technical report cover page form. A sample technical report cover page is located as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. As the form is downloadable from FDOT's Policy and Process Management Unit website, a link to this website can be found on the resources page. Please note that for projects where the EFH assessment is included as a section of the NRE, the same cover page would be used for the cover of the NRE. The level of detail required in the EFH assessment may vary depending on the degree to which the project may adversely affect EFH. Consider project-specific conditions such as ecological importance or sensitivity of the area, the type and extent of EFH that would be impacted, and the type of activity proposed. A detailed EFH assessment is prepared for projects that are expected to have substantial adverse effects. This document should include results of on-site inspections, views of experts on the affected species or habitat, including ETAC comments from ETDM, a literature review, an analysis of alternatives to the proposed project, and any other relevant information. More detail on suggested contents and examples of EFH assessments are included in NMFS's February 2004 document, Preparing Essential Fish Habitat Assessments, a guide for federal action agencies. A link to this document can be found on the resources page. Information for the EFH assessment should be gathered for species included in the Programming Screen Summary Report or on the abbreviated managed species list using the fishery management plans as explained previously. General information is available from the Fishery Management Council and NMFS offices listed as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. It may be useful to include a table of species and EFH that may be affected. The best available information must be used to determine the effects on the proposed project on EFH. FDOT's determination of effects should be clearly stated in the assessment. It is recommended that EFH assessment be concluded with the use of best management practices, avoidance and minimization measures, and mitigation strategies if needed. Any commitments proposed in the EFH assessment should be clearly listed out at the end of the document. These commitments must be coordinated with the appropriate FDOT offices prior to submittal of the NRE or tech memo to ensure that the commitment is feasible. For the final step in EFH assessment, the district submits the draft NRE, including the EFH assessment, to OEM for review. After comment resolution with OEM, the district submits the final NRE to the appropriate agencies for coordination and consultation. It is preferable for the EFH assessment to be submitted to NMFS as early as possible. The best practice is to submit the NRE prior to public hearing so that consultation will be completed before the NRE goes on public display to complete consultation and prevent potential project delays. Completed EFH assessments should be sent to the appropriate NMFS Habitat Conservation Division Florida office at least 60 days prior to a final decision on the proposed project, or at least 90 days prior if substantial adverse impacts are anticipated. Listed here are the NMFS contacts for each district. This information is provided as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. Consultation is initiated when NMFS receives an EFH assessment and a written request for consultation. The district is responsible for submitting both the EFH assessment and the written consultation request. The negotiated procedure for conducting EFH consultation is specified in the July 19, 2000 finding among NMFS, FHWA, and FDOT. There are several key components involved in the NMFS consultation process. First, the district should prepare an EFH assessment and submit the document to NIMS. After reviewing the EFH assessment, NIMS then proposes conservation recommendations to the district, and finally, FDOT will provide NIMS with responses to these conservation recommendations. Please refer to NIMS's document EFH Consultation Guidance version 1.1 for more detailed information regarding the EFH consultation process. A link to this guidance document is found on the resources page. Consultation is required for emergency federal actions that may adversely affect EFH. These actions include hazardous material cleanup, response to natural disasters, or actions to protect public safety. FDOT should contact NIMS early in emergency response planning. Consultation may occur after the fact if not practicable, before the emergency action. For more information regarding emergency consultation with NIMS, please refer to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Emergency EFH Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation procedures for FDOT projects provided as a figure in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. Once the NIMS receives the EFH assessment, it will prepare a written project evaluation as a letter, memo, or email. This evaluation may include non-binding EFH conservation recommendations and measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects on EFH. Unless a shorter timeframe is agreed to, coordination must comply with the timeline mandated by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which requires EFH assessments to be submitted to NIMS at least 60 days prior to a final decision on an action. If NIMS provides conservation recommendations, FDOT is required to respond to them within 30 days of receipt, explaining how DOT will proceed. If the signed finding of no significant impact or FONSI, record of decision, or other final action that includes FDOT's response to conservation recommendations cannot be completed in 30 days, or DOT does not yet have a response to the conservation recommendations, then an interim response should be sent to NIMS before the specified deadline. Sample letters are provided as figures in Part 2, Chapter 17 of the PD&E manual. Once an interim response is provided, a detailed written response should be submitted to NIMS at least 10 days prior to taking final action, such as signing a FONSI or ROD. The response should include a description of measures proposed by FDOT for avoiding or mitigating the impact of the proposed activity on EFH. The response should also include the NEPA assignment statement. If the response is inconsistent with the NIMS EFH conservation recommendations, FDOT must explain its rationale for not following the conservation recommendations, including the scientific justification for the anticipated effects of the project or measures needed to avoid, minimize, or mitigate such effects. The NOAA Assistant Administrator for Fisheries can request a meeting with the Director of OEM to discuss the proposed project and the opportunity to resolve disagreements per 50 CFR Section 600.920K2. The district may update the NRE using addenda to reflect agency coordination or consultation.
Let's move on to Lesson 5, Documentation of EFH Assessments. For Type 1 categorical exclusions and non-major state actions, documentation must demonstrate the proposed project has no significant effects. For these projects, include a summary of agency coordination and compensation for impacts in the SWEPT project file as supporting information to the Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist or the non-major state action checklist as appropriate. Please refer to Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E manual for more information regarding the Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist and Part 2, Chapter 10 for more information regarding the non-major state action checklist. If an EFH assessment was prepared for a Type 1 categorical exclusion or non-major state action, it should be included in the SWEPT project file. Note that for Type 1 categorical exclusions or non-major state actions, the EFH assessment review and resulting project evaluation and conservation recommendations, when provided, would be handled during the permitting process. For Type 2 categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, state environmental impact reports or environmental impact statements, prepare the environmental document and process as described in the applicable chapters in Part 1 of the PD&E manual. This statement should be included in the Essential Fish Habitat section of the environmental document when an EFH assessment was prepared. The EFH assessment section of the Natural Resource Evaluation and associated consultation correspondence should be summarized in the environmental document, and the final NRE should be retained in the project file. Any NMFS conservation recommendations, as well as FDOT's responses, are included in the appendix and made an addendum to the EFH assessment section of the NRE. For Type 2 CEs, these are linked to the Type 2 categorical exclusion determination form in SWEPT if applicable. There may not be enough information for FDOT in coordination with NMFS to make a determination about the effect of a project on EFH. Consequently, consultation may not be completed during the PD&E phase of a project. If EFH consultation cannot be completed during the PD&E phase, it will be carried forward into design and permitting. Any NMFS conservation recommendations considered for inclusion as commitments in the environmental document must be coordinated with the appropriate FDOT offices to ensure the commitment is feasible. The district should consult with the district management prior to making conservation recommendations a commitment. Commitments related to EFH made by FDOT over the course of project development should be documented according to FDOT's project commitment tracking procedure and included in the commitment section of the environmental document. The project commitment tracking procedure is available on FDOT's Policy and Process Management Unit website. Please note that more detailed information is available in Part 2, Chapter 22 of the PD&E Manual and the NEPA Introductory Course Commitments. Prior to the project advancing to the next phase, for example, from design to construction, the impacts to EFH or mitigation strategies are reevaluated per Part 1, Chapter 13 of the PD&E Manual. A reevaluation should also be conducted if there are major design changes, such as a shift in alignment or a change in the size or number of bridge piles. In addition, design changes could reinitiate consultation, which would be addressed through the permitting process. Changes in impacts to EFH or mitigation strategies after approval of the environmental document must be documented in the reevaluation form for Part 2, Chapter 13 of the PD&E Manual. Commitments and coordination should be contained in the commitment status section of the reevaluation form. More detailed information on reevaluations is available in the NEPA Introductory Course Reevaluations. The Office of Environmental Management maintains a central library of training materials as well as documents and publications, including manuals, handbooks, guidelines, and agreements. Key references pertinent to this training include the Environmental Management Academy course catalog, which is in FDOT's learning curve.